Hey, this is Dominic, and this is your home for the cutting-edge conversations on optimizing your personal performance, lighting up your sex life, and living a purpose-driven life of your own design.
These are the topics that Dominic and I have both struggled with in our own lives and still don't always get right. This is Brian. Welcome to the Great Man Podcast.
This is episode number 2 of our 6-part mini-series, our final ride together on the Great Man Within podcast. It's about the journey and not the destination. But in order to have a meaningful journey, you also have to pick a destination that excites you. And that's why the first episode was on picking your bold move for 2023. Your bold move is a courageous and decisive act in pursuit of the life that you want to live. Right? Executing on a bold move in your life fires up every other element and area of your life. And so if you hear that sentence again, that your bold move is a courageous and decisive act in pursuit of the life that you want to live, you'll recognize that there's a really important word in the middle of that sentence, the word pursuit. Neuroscience has shown that the number one contributor of pursuit, of motivation, of drive, is the molecule of dopamine. And if you understand dopamine, you can start to understand the formula for motivation and feelings of reward and success that you feel internally. This episode is going to be a summary of the greatest teachings of 2 of the contemporary authorities on dopamine. Number 1, Dr. Andrew Huberman, who's a world-renowned neuroscientist and kind of is to dopamine what Brene Brown is to vulnerability. And number 2, Dr. Anna Lembke, who's a medical director of Stanford's Addiction Medicine Office and the author of the New York Times bestselling Dopamine Nation, which is a book that I've read, Dopamine Nation, Finding Balance in the Age of Indulgence. Now, as Huberman would say, there's a molecule in your brain and body that when it's released tends to make you look outside of yourself, to pursue things outside of yourself, and to come to crave things outside of yourself. And that molecule is dopamine. Dopamine is the molecule of motivation, pursuit, and desire. Dopamine is the universal currency of foraging and seeking. These are Huberman quotes. And Dr. Anna Lembke, who wrote Dopamine Nation, said, dopamine may play a bigger role in the motivation to get a reward rather than the pleasure of the reward itself. And this is why Huberman sometimes talks about dopamine hits as being a misnomer, right? Those hits, those rewards, because yes, while dopamine is rewarding, what dopamine's primary responsibility is to get us into motivation, craving, movement, and desire and drive. And we're going to talk about that in a big way on today's podcast. There's a well-known Stanford study conducted around school kids who loved drawing, right? Drawing is intrinsically rewarding to a lot of kids, right? The art of creativity and expressing themselves. But in this study, what they did was they took the kids who loved to draw and the teachers started giving kids gold stars for their drawings, which is an extrinsic reward. Over time, the kids started to value that extrinsic reward so that when the teachers started to take away those gold stars, it reduced the kids' joy and the intrinsic reward that they received in drawing, and they started to draw less. That's a really cruel experiment if you think about it, but it does highlight the fact that when we overemphasize the destination reward, in this case, the gold star, it starts to ruin the intrinsic rewards of the process itself. And we are talking about emphasizing the journey and not the destination. So how do we start to build back the love of the drawing, the metaphor for the journey that we're on in our lives? So today's episode has 3 parts to it. First, we're going to be going over 11 things to understand about dopamine. And those are all distilled from the teachings of Dr. Andrew Huberman and Dr. Anna Lembke. Part 2, 3 training tips to build your dopamine baseline for a more sustained level of drive and motivation in your life. And part 3 is how to design your dopamine detox. Because many of us are doing these pleasure-seeking activities unconsciously in drift, like checking our phone too many times a day, sugar hits, pornography, watching TV, whatever your poison is, to detox that, because abstinence resets the brain's reward pathway. And that's a direct quote from Dr. Anna Lemke. And finally, once you become well-versed in the role of dopamine in your life and how it fuels drive and motivation and getting big things done, come take that education and apply it, as we're all getting together to do the masterclass on helping you pick your bold move for 2023. Your bold move is a courageous and decisive act in pursuit of the life that you want to live. And when you execute on the one thing in your life that's important, it fires up all other areas in your life. So in the top of the show notes is the link to the registration. It's a 90-minute masterclass on Thursday, December the 8th. And you do not have to attend live. Everyone's going to get a replay. And it's a $25 USD investment. And that link is at the top of the show notes. Let's get into today's episode. Oh man, aren't you a sight for sore eyes, Bri? This podcast has been missing you, man. We were off the air for about 6 weeks, and the last episodes that I recorded were solo. The audience of the Great Man Within podcast demands Brian Stacy, and you are back and better than ever, man. Good to see you again.
I am back, and it's good. It's good to be in the saddle with you, Dom. It's good. I enjoy these conversations. You know, I think a question that I get sometimes from friends or even from family members are like, what's up with the podcast? Like, why do you do it? You know, and when I think about when we started this thing, I had a sexual health business. I was getting into the men's work stuff and the inner work, and it made a lot of sense from certainly from a business standpoint to be doing it. And that business went away back in 2019, and here we are in 2020, at the end of 2022, still recording. And so I think the questions are fair from friends and family, but why do I do it? And the answer is, I love jamming with you. I love learning new stuff. This topic continues to evolve, and my understanding of it continues to evolve. So this has been a great spot for connection and learning for me.
That's awesome to hear, man. I mean, we started recordings for this podcast 4 years ago, right? We started in November, December of 2018, getting ready for a January launch. And if you think about 4 years of podcasting, I mean, that's a university education. Like 4 years is a long time that we've been doing this and doing it consistently. And it's, there's a lot that you and I are going to be talking about in one of our final episodes, which is just kind of looking back at the 4 years we've had together and our favorite episodes and our top lessons that we've learned, and unpacking all of that for our listeners. But before we do that, I'm just curious, where are you at right now emotionally? Because, last week I made the announcement. You were going to be there last week, but you had a tragic passing of a man, a friend of yours in your life, that caused you last second to have to drop everything, fly out to Los Angeles. And that's a whole other conversation I think we'll probably touch on at certain parts today. But I'm just curious, man, like, where are you emotionally, knowing that we've got this final ride that we're taking our listeners on, but it's our final ride in this cockpit together as, the ones who are flying this plane.
Yeah. You mentioned my friend's passing, and I felt some emotions. I felt a lot of emotions there, but they came in waves, and they changed over a period of time. And I felt deep sadness. I felt anger, and I liked the analogy of the waves because there's space in between waves, and that space would change and grow. So when I think about this podcast, it's similar. There are waves that come and hit. And I certainly feel sadness, and that's one flavor of a wave. But another flavor of a wave, after a little bit of space, comes excitement. And okay, cool, what's next? And there's been a lot of creative energy and time that's gone into this podcast, and wondering where that's going to go next without knowing exactly where it's going to go next is exciting for me. So I'm feeling sadness for sure. I'm feeling excitement for sure. And I'm feeling just little waves of gratitude too that are kind of slipping in there between some of the bigger ones.
Sure. I'm excited to feel into what is it going to be like as we record our final episodes, as like the finish line becomes closer, like what are some of the feelings that are going to come up then? And so, yeah, I'm just excited to see what that brings. And also the reflections. I'm actually very much looking forward to going through the catalog of 320 episodes. I'm not going to listen to all of them, but I'm going to, look through the titles and just remember like what was important during those time periods and extracting the top lessons that we've learned from going on this adventure together.
It's been one of the most life-changing events for me, because whether we had guests on talking about periods and women's cycles, or guys on talking about how they run 17 businesses and get up at 5 a.m., or, doctors that talk about our dick health, like all of that stuff. Like some of that I've integrated, some of that I've tried to integrate and haven't so well, but it's been a massive learning for me too. So I'm excited to reflect on it and thinking about where we were personally and professionally back in 2018, 2019. It was just a totally different animal today. And that's part of the excitement too, is that what is it like to go forward with this new knowledge and this new skill into whatever's next?
Right on. Well, neither you or I are feeling 100% today. Both of us feel like we could have COVID, like 50% chance. So we're really, truly limping to the finish line of 2022. But let's set the stage for this conversation we're going to have today, because I know we're both really passionate about it. We're on this 6-week final ride together around the theme of it's about the journey and not the destination, right? And I shared in the last episode about how for most of my life, for all of my life, I've understood this concept intellectually that, it's about the journey, because that's where you spend the vast majority of your time, and not the destination, whether that destination being making a certain income level, finding yourself married, being at a certain physical fitness level, body weight, financial independence, whatever that destination is that you're striving for. I've always understood intellectually that, it's about the journey and what you learn along the way and who you become. But if I really looked at my operating system and how I responded to the journey, it was heavily driven by wanting to get to the finish line as fast as possible.
And I don't think you're alone in that. I think that's how most of us operate.
I know I'm not alone in that.
And it's like, it's almost like, I get it. It's about the journey. It's about the journey. It's about the journey. But the thing that I want.
Give it to me now.
Yeah. But give me the thing that I want. So knock it off with the platitudes and the men's work 101, and it's about the journey. Just give me the damn thing. So I don't think you're alone in that. I've certainly felt that way and operated that way.
So one of the best ways for us to practice being on the journey part of the equation is understanding the power of picking a bold move, right? This is something that I've done every year for the past 10 years or over that, going into the new year. A bold move is the one thing that if you execute on it will fire up your entire life, right? A bold move is a courageous and decisive act in pursuit of the life that you want to live. In the last episode, I gave examples of writing a book to establish, my presence as a coach and a thought leader. Launching this podcast was a bold move. Launching a mastermind was a bold move. Leaving my corporate job after 15 years was a bold move. And when you stack those bold moves up year over year over year, it really helps to create the life that you want to live. So these bold moves, the completion of the bold moves, like the book actually being written or the podcast being launched, those could be looked at as destinations. And those destinations, picking an inspiring destination is really important to give meaning to the journey. And what we're going to be talking about today is, okay, if you're going to pick a bold move, to then start to calibrate what the journey feels like for you, to not delay your reward until the time the book is written or you quit the job or you do the thing you want, but to feel reward all along the path. And in that definition I give you of bold move, which is a courageous and decisive act in pursuit of the life you want to live, pursuit is a critical word. And one of the molecule that is responsible for drive and motivation and pursuit in our lives is the molecule of dopamine. And dopamine is like having a moment. Like it's never been sexier than before because we have neuroscientists like Dr. Andrew Huberman, who's, on every major podcast and talk show now talking about how dopamine is the currency that helps you to understand feelings of pleasure and success in your life, but also the driving force of motivation. So today we're going to be talking about, what are 11 of the things you need to understand about dopamine, how to train to build your dopamine baseline, and how to do a dopamine detox when you're way out of balance and pleasure seeking. But I want to spend a minute talking about how this even came into being, this conversation around dopamine, and so important because we were on a recent trip together and one of our mastermind immersions where you started to recognize that you were feeling a complete lack of motivation and drive. And why don't you touch on that for us for a minute?
Yeah. I've been in this place, and sometimes we'll call it the void or the not knowing what's next. And I couldn't understand why I wasn't driven like I had been in the past. And I think you and a couple other people have asked me, like, well, when was it in your past, Brian, that you were like totally lit up for life and bouncing out of bed? And I was like, gosh, man, it's been a while. But I remember feeling that when I launched my first business in the first couple of years of that, when I launched my second business in the first year and a half of that, I'm like, man, I was really lit up. People got tired of me talking about sexual health. Right? The conversation at dinner would be like, where did you learn about sexual health? And that's all I would really care about. But I was lit up. And I haven't felt that kind of litness for a while. And I was searching for that again, but like really, really unclear on what I needed to do or how to get that back. On our trip to Arizona, there were a couple things that happened that moved me from, I wonder what's going on or how do I get there, to like, something's off. Something is just plain and simple off. And one of the things that happened is we were hiking down a mountain. I was leading the group, so I was making sure that everybody else was following close enough behind. And I saw two women walk by me. And that's all I really picked up on, is there was two women walking by me. And I looked back to make sure the guys were close enough. And I saw one of the guys, his eyes just popped out of his head. It was just fully taking in these two women that just walked by me. And I think he didn't say anything, but if he were to say something, it would have sounded something like, holy shit, these two women are unbelievably hot. And like that's what his face said. And I had two reactions, like two thoughts hit me simultaneously. One was, dude, put your eyeballs back in your head. Come on. Like, get it together. And then something way more visceral like hit me, which was, wait a second, Brian, like, why didn't you notice that these two women walking by may have been attractive? And at the moment, it didn't even register that they might have been. I didn't really even look at them. I also started reflecting on recent interactions that I had at the airport where I haven't really noticed anybody attractive around me. And I was like, wait, something is off here. And so I started to tie together this feeling of sexual desire and motivation with motivation for professional pursuits, with motivation to get in the gym and get my body in a shape that feels really good, with eating. And there seemed to be some sort of common tie between all of these things. And when I brought this up with all the men at the men's group, I saw a lot of heads nodding, with guys being like, yeah, like that's weird. Like I feel really numb also. So what the challenge I gave myself at the time, I said, okay, I think that, and as we've talked about in this podcast before, our sexual energy is the same as our creative energy. And that's why when we aren't being sexual, when we're abstaining from sex or masturbation, a lot of times we get more creative, we get more motivated. So I knew that much. So I knew, hey, let's start there. Let me start on a 30-day, no masturbation, no ejaculation, and let's just see what happens to my creative energy. Maybe that'll bring back my like desiring to see attractive people and direction for work and everything else. So that's where we started. And what we're going to talk about today on this podcast is, it turns out there is very real science behind that. And it's been the most exciting thing that I've seen in the personal development space for a long time, because it gives me a way to monitor like where I'm at from a motivation and movement standpoint, and very specific things that I can do to, I like to call it raise the base. And I know we'll get into the details of what that means here in a moment. But like, how do I start to raise that currency of dopamine in my body so that I feel that motivation and I feel that desire for movement?
Yeah, and this is big. And this is what led us to you and me creating our own dopamine detoxes, which we're going to go over at the end of the episode, so that the men who are listening can design their own dopamine detoxes. Because we're about 12 days in, maybe you're a little bit longer than me, and I'm already starting to feel the effects of how I'm showing up in my everyday. So why don't we go into the 11 things to understand about dopamine, right? These aren't the only 11 things, but these are 11 things that I've culled down from Dr. Andrew Huberman, who basically is to dopamine as Brene Brown is to vulnerability.
That's fair. Great analogy.
You know, like Brene, that's right. Like she owns the word vulnerability. When you hear the word dopamine these days, Dr. Andrew Huberman like kind of owns that category. And his colleague at Stanford, Dr. Anna Lemke, who is I think she's the medical director for the Stanford Addiction Center. And she wrote the book Dopamine Nation, which I heard Huberman recommend. And so I read that book, and I've cracked out on probably 7 hours worth of podcasts that the two of them are on. And I took copious notes, and I've distilled these 11 insights that I think are the most important things to understand about dopamine. So I'm going to go through a couple of them at a time and then like pause for us to talk. So the first one is you have a baseline of dopamine and spikes of dopamine. The baseline is considered the tonic dopamine, and spikes of dopamine is considered phasic. I don't know if you need to really understand tonic and phasic other than there is a baseline of dopamine, and how you feel moment by moment is completely relative to where your baseline has been. What that means is if like you have a low baseline of dopamine because you've depleted it by jerking off a ton, watching a lot of porn, eating a lot of sugar, disappearing into social media scroll, all of these things that give you like dumps of dopamine, your baseline will continue to deplete. After you have these spikes, your baseline will deplete. And so how you feel is completely dependent upon like what you were feeling previously. And if what you were feeling previously was a real low, when you eat something that typically gave you a spike, it's not going to feel that great. It's kind of like what we experience, what addicts experience with that first high is really high, but in order to balance it out, your dopamine baseline goes down. You start to feel experiences of pain. So you want to get that drug again to get the next high, but you're bouncing off of a lower baseline. So the high isn't as high anymore. So that's how the baseline and the spikes start to work.
It happens with cookies too, just so we're really clear. That first cookie is always just amazing, and the rest are just sad.
What a 4-year theme that ties all the way through as Brian's loves and analogies for cookies. The second thing to understand about dopamine is this is the pleasure-pain balance. And this is something that Dr. Anna Lemke writes about in her book, Dopamine Nation. I found it to be fascinating. She says, the brain processes pleasure and pain in the same place. And pleasure and pain work like opposite sides of a balance. So think about like a seesaw, where you remember when you were a kid, you're kind of on a teeter-totter or seesaw, whatever you call it. Each pleasure that you experience will be followed by a pain that's equal to the pleasure you just experienced. So what this means is, the way she describes it is your body wants to be in a state of homeostasis. The body likes balance. It does not like to be out of balance for too long. When we're experiencing dopamine spikes, the teeter-totter swings into the place of pleasure, right? So we win something, we eat the chocolate cake, we're watching television, we're listening to our favorite music, and we're snuggling with our partner. That's a lot of dopamine that's happening all at once. And then after it's done, to balance it back out, you kind of feel that pain. So now all of the weight goes to the pain side of the equation, and you can start to feel a low, a malaise, a lack of energy, a lack of motivation. And it takes time in order for that balance to come back into equilibrium. The problem, Bri, is most of us don't wait for the balance to come back into equilibrium on its own. It's so painful that we reach for the next cookie, or we watch the next Netflix episode, or we jerk off again, and then we go back and forth out of balance.
There's a really fascinating biological history on this. So when we think about, let's go back to the caveman days, and why did our body evolve in this way? And it was dopamine, as we said. This is the movement and motivation center, the chemical that tells us to go. And so back in the day when we went hunting and we would kill something and we would bring it back and we would eat it, that felt great. But if we did that just once and we weren't motivated again to go out and do it again, we would die because we need to continue to eat. So the body has evolved this really sophisticated mechanism using dopamine to say, hey, it's time to go and get that thing. Now, back in the day when this evolved, getting that thing was difficult. There was some pursuit. I mean, I can't think of a better analogy than hunting. It's literally like, gotta put your gear together, get outside, go hunt, be in danger. And so there was a really strong pursuit associated with that payoff. And so when Dominic talks about this pleasure pain thing, right? The pleasure is getting the animal, cooking it for your family, eating it. Great, your body is satiated. And then because of the spike in dopamine, our body is automatically then going to drop after that, lower our baseline, cause us pain to go seek again, to go like, wait a second, I want to get rid of this pain. The problem is now in today's society, getting access to those pleasure hits, some people even call them dopamine hits maybe, but those pleasure hits are so fast and so easy, there's no pursuit. You pick up your phone and you play a game. You grab a cookie out of the cabinet. You throw on some porn and jerk off. All of that, you can go from pain to pleasure in seconds. And so all we're doing is we're spiking and then depleting, spiking and depleting, spiking and depleting. And pretty soon we've depleted so much, our baseline is so low, we sit there and we wonder like, God, I just ate 3 cookies, watched 9 Netflix shows, and like, why do I feel like shit? I don't feel like doing anything. Huh.
What you just said is so critical, and it leads to this third insight that when I sent you the Huberman podcast and I sent Keith the Huberman podcast, we all, on our own, highlighted this very next insight. Like we all texted it to you all texted it to me separately, and I had already written this down. The third insight is pleasure without prior pursuit is absolutely terrible for us. Pleasure without prior pursuit is absolutely terrible for us because no pursuit means no pain, no prior pain. And you're depleting dopamine and lowering your baseline just by getting those pleasure hits. And so Huberman, the example he gives is TikTok. The reason why TikTok is so addictive is it's just like one hit after another, like 20 seconds of joy, of pleasure. And the example that you had given about when you went out to hunt, you got the thing, you came back, there was a whole ordeal that was gone through in order to get to get that reward. But now if we're feeling depleted, if we feel a low baseline, instead of having to effort at all, there's no effort in picking up your phone. And that's why we're reaching for it. I think some studies show like 100 to 200 times a day, right? So pleasure without prior pursuit is terrible for us. The fourth insight is focusing only on the reward at the end makes work in the moment feel terrible for us, right? Focusing only on the reward at the end makes work in the moment feel terrible for us. This is the classic prioritizing the destination over the journey. Brian, I mean, how many people do you know? And at periods of time in my life, I was this person where I just disliked the work I was doing, but the reward was the paycheck. The reward was, well, in 40 years, I'm going to have, this much freedom so that I can finally do the things I want. And you see how many people slave away, make these trade-offs of, I don't really like the work I'm doing. It doesn't light me up. But this promise of, I will reach Narnia at some point. And we see that never really works out because when you've had 40 years of training around not liking your life, not loving your life, that's a conditioning that's really hard to turn on a dime, when day one of your retirement shows up.
Especially when we're unaware of the mechanisms that are creating our thoughts and creating our body to move or not move. we can go, and I have gone now months and months and months not realizing that I had low dopamine levels, because we live in a society that allows for us to get those hits so freaking quickly. So if you're somebody that's in that job for 40 years, there's a good chance that you're getting the dopamine hits somewhere, even though you're totally focused on the outcome of the thing that's going to happen. And you're operating at that low level for such a long time, you don't even know it.
Right.
So of course you're going to focus on just the outcome, but you're going to be wondering the entire time while you're on the journey, why the fuck it feels so terrible.
That's right. Well said. One thing I'm going to do with all of these insights and this entire episode is I'm putting it into a PDF, which I'm going to make available for download for anyone who comes to the Bold Move Masterclass, because I think this is so important to have this list to refer back to of like, what are these do's and don'ts and critical understandings and how to create your own detox. So if you're enjoying this episode, what I'm going to do is I'm going to turn this into a downloadable cheat sheet for anyone who comes to the masterclass. And that link is at the top of the show notes. So to punctuate this point about focusing only on the reward at the end makes the work in the moment feel terrible, I think it was Martina Navratilova who said this, the tennis star. She said, the thrill of victory is so fleeting and transient that in order for you to be successful for an extended period of time in what you're doing, you have to love the journey. Right? You have to learn how to love, to practice and to show up. And that's why, all the greats, like I look at Tom Brady, 22 years in the league, that guy can't be doing what he's doing and continue to win. He's won 7 Super Bowls. It can't just be about winning the Super Bowl. It has to be about his love for showing up every day and doing what he's doing and getting more and more excellent at his craft. That's what keeps the persistence in him coming back. Insight number 5, peak chasing is dangerous. So instead, focus on building your baseline. One of the things that Huberman talks about is beware of the high, right? Anything with a high dopamine release has the potential to be abused. And that's, where addiction comes in, but also thrill seekers like Jackass, the guy like the Jackass movies, like Steve-O and Bam and those guys. They had a good run with Jackass movies that came out every few years, but I think it was like a decade before their last movie came out. And I remember reading about how half of the guys, maybe all of them, were addicted to something. I think it was Steve-O who was like, I've been in a depression since the last time we did our movie. And like, I'm hoping the guys will come back and do another movie because it's the only thing that makes me feel alive. And if you think about what those guys did in their movies, some of the shit, man, like getting in a grocery cart and riding down a hill or taking a dump in a Home Depot, just the thrill of these things were so high that they couldn't experience the mundane of life without being tragically bored. Like they would come crashing down. So they needed to fill it with other thrill seeking or drug chasing activities. And that's no way to live a life, man.
And 2 really important items on this. For each person, these behaviors, whatever the high is, might be different. Maybe you don't have a sweet tooth, so a cookie doesn't do it for you, right? But as you'll see here, we'll talk about in a moment, our belief of something that we like can literally change the amount of dopamine that gets infused into our system when we do it. And so as you're thinking about this, and as Dominic's going through these 11 items, think through, what are those things that I feel a draw to that gives me that high, that gives me that temporary thing, even if I feel bad about it afterwards. So each individual is very different. I think the second thing, and this is a really important theme that we've talked about throughout this podcast. We've talked about this with porn before. We've talked about this in other areas of life. What we're not advocating for here is a strict abstinence. We're not saying don't ever do the things that give you a peak. That's not what we're saying. What we're saying is understand that you have a currency to use, just like a dollar bill pays for something at the store. And you need to choose when you want that peak, because the peaks are amazing. Just because we get to enjoy the journey doesn't mean we don't get to enjoy the peak. We absolutely can. But just know that we're going to be using our currency to get to that peak. And I think it's an important piece here, that peaks aren't bad, but chasing them continuously will lower your levels of overall motivation.
And when you experience a peak, understand that you are going to rebalance by going to an equal level of pain afterwards, and to let that process run its course. Because if you use the quick pleasure-seeking dopamine hits with no prior effort, like the social media, the cookies, etc., then what you're doing is you're flip-flopping, and lowering your baseline in the process.
I had a buddy this week tell me that he loves running. And he's like, dude, I don't know what it is, but I love running. But after I get back from the run for maybe 20 minutes afterwards, I feel like sad. I feel like almost depressed. He's like, which is the opposite that you're supposed to get when you run. But this is what he's experiencing. He loves the run. Okay, cool. And he's aware enough to identify that for whatever reason, he feels unmotivated. And it lasts 20 minutes, 25 minutes maybe. That's what he said. So, okay, cool. So we know what's going on there now.
So let's talk about why that might be happening too. And this is number 6 on the list, which is stackamine dopamine releasing behaviors can cause problems. So, Huberman talked about this. This was a big insight for you and I. Let's use the example of working out, like the run that your friend goes on. Sometimes people will take a pre-workout drink. They'll cue up their favorite music and then go for the workout, right? These 3 things all increase dopamine. These are big dopamine stacking behaviors. So you're getting a huge dump of dopamine. And of course, it is going to increase your performance, right? Like that's the whole reason why you do it. And it feels euphoric when you're on the run. But as we just talked about, what comes up must go back down. So after the run, where the favorite music was blasting, the workout was pumping dopamine, and the pre-workout drink was going crazy, then your system needs to reset itself. So what Huberman talks about is start to train where you don't need all of these dopamine-inducing behaviors just to get to the starting line. When he works out, he'll only use maybe one of those energy drinks like once every so often, but primarily he'll go without music. Maybe he'll listen in the gym to the background music, and he'll just go and work out so that he can train in that environment and get his body and build his dopamine baseline that way.
Yeah, it's kind of like pick your things, right? Either listen to the music or go work out or take the pre-workout or whatever. Or if you want to spend your dopamine in that area, okay, great. Just know that the crash is going to come. And I think that's great.
So number 7 on that insight list is identifying no-goes. And Huberman talks about, 25 times a day, kind of pushing a pause and being like, no go on that dopamine impulse, that dopamine seeking impulse, like that pleasure reward. So some of the things that you and I have talked about is all those times the phone, you're like, I want to go to my phone. Whoop. Nope. Because what I'm doing here is I'm bringing clarity to when am I pleasure seeking or when do I actually need my phone for some utility function. One of the things that I found out was, I chew 7 sticks of gum a day. It first started as I would have a piece of gum after a meal to get the taste out of my mouth. And, if I'm talking to people, I don't want to have bad breath, or if there's something stuck in my teeth, it helps to get it out. But then it was oh, this is a burst of flavor that gives me kind of a juicy hit of joy. And I realized how many times over the course of the day I felt that pull. So now those are wrapped into my no-goes.
If you take away anything from this podcast, this is the most important thing. So we have no-goes. I think he says he has 25 a day that he looks to say no to things so that he raises his dopamine baseline. That's great. That's good. Good math there. But here's the real alchemy. The real alchemy, and when we talk about it's about the journey, not just the destination, this is it. When we learn to build the want for desire over the outcome, that's when things start to change. So when Dominic wants that piece of gum and he says no, his body is still desiring that gum. That can feel confronting, like an addict, if you think about it that way. I want the gum, I want the gum, I want the gum. But we can also start to understand that feeling of desire and fall in love with that. And be like, whoa, I want that gum. How crazy does that feel? Whoa, yeah. I want to go watch that TV show. I'm going to say no. I'm still going to want to go watch the TV show. Whoa, that's that feeling of desire. And we've talked about this on the podcast many times when it comes to love or it comes to gratitude, all these different emotions, but we haven't really talked about it with like understanding and fully feeling that feeling of desire. And that is where I can physically feel that dopamine baseline moving up, because I'm like, there it is. There's the desire. I still want it. That's okay. I don't have to have it right now.
And that goes hand in hand with sex and sexual pursuit, right? Is falling in love with the feeling of desire in your body versus the release of that desire and feeling that momentary pleasure. Like, as guys, we all know, like it's an intense, insane 4 seconds of orgasmic pleasure. But then there's that refractory period before we have to build it back up again. And I'm on day number 12 now of no masturbation, inspired by our dopamine detox, which we'll talk about in a few minutes. And I get this every time I do one of these, no masturbation, keep the seed in. I notice that, like, when I'm walking through the city and I'm waiting on the subway and a beautiful woman passes by me, the littlest thing, like the way her hair smells, or the way her leggings fit her, my whole body lights up like a Christmas tree. And learning how to hold on to that and to be like in love with that, like you just said, to love the feeling of that more than valuing the feeling of that 4 second release. Because this feeling in my body, I can have all the time if I choose to, all the time. And then what is it? You talked about, again, being creative, right? That sexual energies, that energy then, which started as sexual energy, can then turn into life force energy. So yeah, that's a big one, man. Thanks for hitting that topic. All right. So I'm going to hit a couple of quick ones here that are really interesting. Number 8, caffeine actually has a mild effect on increasing the effects of dopamine. So I was thinking when Huberman was talking about caffeine, he was going to talk about this as like a be careful about caffeine. He said, actually, what caffeine does is it increases the density and efficacy of a certain dopamine receptor, which means it's not necessarily like dumping dopamine. It's just creating more powerful and a greater quantity of receptors to receive the dopamine that's been released. So, he actually is a daily user of caffeine. He recommends yerba mate, which I guess has some other additional benefits, but caffeine is something that increases the effects of dopamine.
So what we're talking about here is the biochemical effect of caffeine. That's what Dominic just described. There is also the desire-seeking behavior of an addiction to something that we love, which is going to have an impact on dopamine. Dominic, I don't know about you, but I still love my bulletproof coffee. I do it pretty much every day, but it's a bit of a pain in the ass to make. So when I go on vacation, I typically don't do it. And I typically just don't drink any coffee then when I'm on vacation. When I come back and I have that first one, bulletproof coffee again, I can guarantee you my dopamine levels spike because it's something I love, not necessarily just because of the caffeine. So I just want to make sure those two things aren't confused. That yes, caffeine biochemically has this impact of increasing the effects of dopamine, but because I love doing this so much, I'm going to get a spike.
Number 9, cold exposure can increase dopamine. And what's been really potent about the studies on cold exposure, like cold showers or ice cold baths, is dopamine steadily rises over time and steadily falls over time after cold exposure. There was this one study that was done where a group of men were in, I think it was like 55 degree temperature water, Fahrenheit, for an hour. And like none of us are going to do an hour of 55 degree temperature water, but they found that dopamine levels went up by 250%, which is on par with cocaine. Okay. What it doesn't do is it does not lead to a crash like a cocaine would. So apparently it's like a steady rise and a fall, over a multiple hour period. So what that's done for me is I end up taking longer now cold showers at the end of my hot shower. Instead of 1 minute, now I'm up to I'm doing 4 or 5 minutes a day.
Yeah. If there is a dopamine hack, this feels like it. And I can guarantee you I will never want to take a cold shower, so there's no dopamine hit there. So this is a very safe and effective way to increase the baseline dopamine.
All right, so the last two I'll hit here. Insight number 10 is intermittent reinforcement schedules keep us engaged, right? So intermittent reinforcement schedules keep us engaged, like casinos, where you just don't ever know what the payoff is going to be. Social media has a way of rewarding you or not rewarding you. A post does well, it doesn't do well. The elusive lover who gives you their attention and takes it away. These are prime examples, as Huberman would describe it, of dopamine spiking activities that keep us motivated to continue our pursuit. Intermittent fasting, one of the reasons that, it's become so popular is because intermittent fasting introduces a little bit of pain, hunger and not giving into the craving of that, and then rewarding your body with food at a certain period of time. So starting to understand the intermittent nature of dopamine and the uncertain reward schedule brings in a sense of engagement in your life. And the last one, number 11, and this is probably the most important thing to understand, and this ties into what Brian was talking about before. For life to be rewarding, you have to learn how to experience reward all along the journey. Right? So for life to be rewarding, you have to learn how to experience reward all along the journey. And Brian, like what you said a few moments ago about letting the desire be the reward, that's where life starts to become really interesting. And Tom Bilyeu, who invented Quest Nutrition and Impact Theory, is the podcast that I love. I think he's the greatest interviewer out there. He says in his interview with Huberman, now this makes sense because I've become expert at learning to love the desire of things and undervaluing the payoff of things, because you spend so much more time in the pursuit, in the building, in the desiring, that's really the only intelligent way to live your life is through the building of desire, because that's like you have more control over it. And it quite frankly can be where you spend 99.9% of your life. All right, so just a reminder that I'm going to be summarizing all of those 11 things to understand about dopamine. I'm going to put them into a PDF, which I'm going to make available for anyone who registers for the Bold Move Masterclass. That link is at the top of the show notes. Okay, Bryce, so 3 training tips to build dopamine baselines. And these come again from Huberman. Number 1, train your system to interpret feelings of friction and effort to an internally generated reward system. Right? Train your system to start to interpret feelings of friction and effort to an internally generated reward system. So when you set about doing hard work or doing something that requires your attention and your focus, and even when you're bumping up against obstacles, it's almost like witnessing in your brain that you're at the gym and you're pushing like really heavy weight around. Like when you do that rep, in your mind, I'm getting stronger. And there's something intrinsically rewarding about that.
And you have to trick yourself. You're like, oh, this is good. This is good. This is good. And it's a joke, but it's also kind of true. It's kind of true. It's kind of like, I don't want to have this phone call because it's going to be really hard and I could get rejected. Or like, whoa, I get to get a rep in here and make this phone call and let's see what happens. Right? It's a very subtle difference, but it's a huge difference.
I think at first it starts as tricking yourself. And then over time, these things then become kind of muscle memory, right? I mean, a lot of people don't enjoy working out at first. And then over time, it's like, oh my God, I love working out and I crave it. So training tip number 2 is train yourself to understand that the effort is the good part, not just the achievement of the destination reward. As Huberman would say, when you focus only on the trophy, the grade, the reward, you undermine the entire process. And this goes back to what I referenced in the intro to this podcast, that Stanford study with the kids who loved to draw, and drawing was just an intrinsic reward for them. But when teachers started giving them gold stars for their output, which became an extrinsic motivator, and then when the teacher stopped giving them the stars, the kids who previously loved drawing stopped loving drawing, which is a really cruel experiment if you think about it. But it does highlight for us that the effort is the good part. The journey is the good part. And the third and final training tip is be very careful not to stack sources of dopamine just to get you to the starting line, right? So the music, the Monster energy drink, because that will spike your dopamine and then eventually cause the baseline to erode, and it will feel painful afterwards.
And another example of that really quick is just eating the food, watching the TV show, and having your phone next to you at the same time, right? Now we're stacking 3 different things that are going to drain your dopamine, and you're probably going to feel a huge crash afterwards, more so than if you just ate the food.
Dude, a great example of that the other day, I was watching TV and eating a dinner, and it was turkey chili, And while I was watching the show, I was like, man, this turkey chili needs some spice. So I went and got hot sauce, and that like loads up a lot of flavor, hits the dopamine receptors. The next day I had the same exact turkey chili sitting at my table doing nothing. I wasn't reading, I wasn't watching the phone. And I'm like, let me try this without the hot sauce. And I was like, there's so much flavor in this turkey chili. I don't need anything on it. But because I was in that high dopamine state, I just needed more, the night before with the TV and all these other things going on. My phone was next to me as well. So yeah, right on the money. So the third and final section of this podcast is around how to design your dopamine detox. And this was really inspired by you, buddy, going back to the immersion, the mastermind retreat that we were on, when you came to this recognition that, man, I'm feeling flat. And it's time to kickstart some of that feeling of energy in my body and my system. So why don't you walk through some of the things that you've done? Because as Anna Lemke would say in her book, Dopamine Nation, abstinence resets the brain's reward pathway, right? Abstinence resets the brain's reward pathway. And this is why over the last number of years, I've been such an advocate of abstaining from TV, abstaining from alcohol, abstaining from porn, abstaining from masturbation for temporary periods of time when I feel like I'm out of balance, so that if I want to reintroduce those things, I can do so from a much more intentional, non-drift way. So what's been going on with you, man?
It's hard to sit down and then just create your own dopamine detox, because that's not what I did. What I started to do over a period of time is I started to just recognize what are those things, those activities that I'm being drawn to, where I feel like a really strong desire to do. They happen to be, we talked about the no masturbation, so I started there. So anytime I'm feeling a pull there, I'm like, nope, not going there. And I gotta be honest, that has not been the easiest thing in the world. So I said, okay, great, we're gonna start there. That was day one. I was able to put that on the list.
For how long?
So I said for 30 days, I'm not going to do it. Based on what I've been seeing here over the last 20 plus days, this feels like a life habit. This feels like a high leverage activity for me to not do, because I can really feel
so you're not going to masturbate at all?
I don't know. We'll see, but it started with the 30 days. So if we're just doing, let's say, a detox of some sort, I think this one has been a really powerful one for me. So I started with that one. I knew there was going to be some other low-hanging fruit. Sweets have always been a big thing for me. I've gone in cycles of eating way too much and binging sweets, and then going for a 30-day abstinence period where I don't have any, and I couldn't seem to find that middle ground of, can I just have one? Like, what the hell? Why can't I just have one? And I know a lot of people that I've talked to feel this way about food, feel about sex, feel about other activities, but for me, it's always been sweets. And so now, whenever I feel that pull to like, let's have dessert, I know, okay, is this where I want to spend my dopamine? Or do I want to build the base instead? And so that has become another activity for me of like, do I want to or do I not? Now, there have been times in this past 20 some days where I wanted a dessert and I said, okay, I'm going to do it. And even the act of having one and then stopping is amazing for my baseline. So I can still have that one and I get a little bit of a hit, but it's not the Cookie Monster style eating of cookies. So that has been another item for me, that it's not abstinence. I'm not doing it. I am doing it very consciously. But the big shift for me is, instead of, it used to be, oh man, I can't have a cookie. And now it's, I'm building up my dopamine baseline. And in a very short period of time, Dominic, I think you said you're 12 days in, I'm 20 some days in here, and I can feel it. I can feel that life force coming back. I can feel how much more I do appreciate that single cookie and being able to say no afterwards. And so I'm starting to really enjoy that desire piece of it. Not fully there yet, but I'm starting to enjoy that. That's been a big one. I used to, when I was bored, play this game on my phone, and I've stopped that altogether. I just said, like, this is a drain on my dopamine baseline, and the payoff's not that great. Abstinence all the way. I'm not messing around with that anymore.
I used to be addicted to Words with Friends. Words with Friends was like, this was maybe like 10 years ago, but anytime there was a free moment, I'd be on Words with Friends going crazy. And I realized that that was completely out of whack, and I had to cut that out of my system for good too.
And for me, it felt innocuous because I would go to the bathroom and play the game for a few minutes. Like, what's the big deal? I'm just going to the bathroom here. But it's just it's like it's almost, you ever seen one of those coolers full of ice and they have the little spigot at the bottom to let the water drain out as it starts to melt? Like, that's what it felt like with my dopamine levels, with playing the game and being on the phone constantly. And so even if I'm in the elevator, if I'm just very conscious of when I'm going to access my phone and when I'm not. The last and final one that I'll talk about here is related to TV watching. I notice if I watch one episode of something, I don't feel any kind of like real pain. There's no pain cycle involved with that. It's just, okay, cool. I got to decompress a little bit and watch a show that I thought was funny or whatever. But when I hit that next button to show 2 or show 3 or show 4, oh man, is the pain cycle. I mean, it happens even before the show's over, but really hits after I hit the stop button. And then, of course, what feels really good is to not feel that. So I want a cookie, or I want another TV show, or I want to masturbate, or whatever, which makes the whole thing a lot harder. So I'm focused on just those areas now. But my guess is that I'm going to be adding to this list over a period of time when I start to feel that pull, because that's the thing that I'm really looking for in my life right now. Is like, where am I feeling that pull to go do some sort of behavior that I can instead abstain from momentarily and build that dopamine baseline.
Solid list, man. And I'm going to hit mine too. I think mine started with 30 days of no masturbation, just like yours. I feel like you almost need an anchor abstinence thing, and then the big one, I think almost for all guys, don't jerk off for 30 days. You'll find out real quick where a lot of your pulls are, because when that's taken away, then the cravings for everything else will start to pop up. And, when you're not masturbating, then porn also is obviously like not on the table either. I've also committed to 1 hour less of phone per day. So I'm looking at my time tracker, I'm on 4 hours of phone use per day, and I'm bringing it down to 3. This is a silly one, but it makes sense. Don't take your phone on the toilet. When you're doing your dump, and you're dumping down, like just bringing the phone on the toilet, like, first of all, it keeps you there for way longer than is necessary.
It's not good for your butthole. Yeah.
It's not good for the beehole. And it's also just another mindless dopamine thing.
I got to ask you, what do you do on the toilet now? Do you meditate on the toilet?
I just poop. I get off and I'm done.
That's
like
it.
I'm very business-like now.
Okay.
I'm on, I'm off, done. 1 hour of TV per day. That's it. With the exception of Sundays where I watch the Jets. That's a little bit, 3 hours, and they're good this year.
Dom, I got to call you on that one. I think good is an overstatement for how the Jets are this year.
Why?
They're not terrible, but are they good?
They're 6-4. They were expected to lose 12 games this season.
Right. So your Jets baseline was so low. Because, like, for example, a classic Patriots fan would see 6-4 and look at that and be like, we've got an okay team this year, not a good team.
Yeah, well, when you're a championship caliber team coming off of it, and then when you're
we're talking about baselines here, I think it's important to hit all the
exactly. That's very true. And how you feel about your life is completely predicated on where you were previously. So the last 2 things I would say is no melatonin. Melatonin was something I used every single night for sleep. And Huberman and Matthew Walker, who wrote the book Why We Sleep, strongly advise against it because they say that melatonin can weaken your baseline dopamine. So I think Matthew Walker said only use melatonin when you're changing time zones, jet lag. And the last thing I'm doing is an extra long cold shower. I've always, done at least a minute of cold shower in the morning. But now I'm doing 3 to 5 minutes so that I can have, that more pronounced dopamine baseline raise, and I'm feeling that. And I would say the payoff, Bri, is these last 2.5 weeks, physically, I've been feeling really crappy from Lyme disease and Lyme disease related stuff. And you and I might both have COVID right about now. And the other day I had to sit down and do some really tedious work that I didn't want to do, operational kind of work, stuff that my chief operating officer would have done, but she's gone on and found a new job. So I don't have that support. And in my mind, I was hearing the story of, This is going to be brutal. You know how to do it. It's going to be painful. You're going to waste whatever. And I caught that and I was like, wait, the effort is the reward. So I'm going to sit down. I'm going to teach myself how to do this. And I ended up building like a partial website. I ended up creating all the operational elements that I needed for 4 hours, even feeling sick and not at my best. I was in the flow state. And I remember like figuring out certain puzzle pieces that I normally would have gone to my COO for. And I was like, oh my God, I'm learning this. And it just kind of kept that reward cycle going. So I was engaged for those 4 hours. And when that 4 hours was up, the rest of that day, I was just like, I just did that, and it felt really good, which increased the desire to do more hard things in the following days.
Jane McGonigal, one of my favorite authors, in her book Super Better, she talks a lot about dopamine. And the reason she talks about it is because they found that when people had a higher dopamine level, they were able to learn a lot more and a lot faster, and it retained a lot easier. So it's not surprising to hear that you're able to sit there for 4 hours, learn something new, integrate it, and raise your dopamine base at the same time, which is spectacular. One of the things I've noticed, Dominic, like we started this topic when I didn't notice really those two women on the mountain that walked by me, and I said, "What is going on here?" And so now, 20 some days in to this dopamine detox, I was sitting on a train in New York City just a couple days ago, and I see this woman walk in. Wouldn't have registered before. This time it registered, and I said, "Wow, like she is really attractive." I at least know enough to keep my eyeballs inside my head and just and sit there in a bit of appreciation. But feeling that desire again felt so good. But it's also somewhat scary when it comes to like, I'm now married, I'm in a committed relationship. And I think there's part of me that felt safety in turning that sexual desire off. And so when the sexual desire came back and there's another woman and we're in the train, I'm like, what do I do with this, right? And so it was really cool. I looked at her, and internally, I didn't talk to her or do anything and make her part of my situation. And there was an internal thing for me. I started to notice, okay, I'm attracted to her. That's cool. Like, what is it about her that I find attractive? And I started to notice, I feel like her facial features and this and that. And then when I saw Becca, I was like, Beck, I saw this woman in the train today that I was super attracted to. And I started to notice what it was I was attracted to. And it turns out like she's got these like really big facial features, like big mouth, big eyes, like almost like a Disney sort of character. Turns out Becca has those same traits, right? Big mouth, big eyes. Like it's something I'm attracted to.
Is big mouth a compliment? Like when you say she has a big mouth, does she feel complimented?
Teeth, big smile, big mouth, totally.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Well, whether she took it as a compliment or not, I don't know, but I'm attracted to that.
Yeah.
physically a big mouth. And it turned into this great conversation about what we find attractive, and how there's more than one person out there that we can be attracted to. But it turned that desire, being able to build that desire in an area in which she wasn't involved, but I could bring that back to the relationship, became a super powerful force very quickly in our relationship. So it feels less scary than it used to. I can slowly turn that spigot of sexual and creative energy back on. And I can do that now just because my dopamine baseline is a little bit higher, allowing me to see those sort of things.
I love that, man. It's a great place to finish because it's about, like you said, the capacity it's just training our nervous system to hold that desire without needing to like pounce on it or to release it or to do anything about this other woman, because you're obviously like, you have no desire. You don't want to do anything with that woman. But isn't it beautiful to be able to experience her gifts and to relish that? Because when you turned it off, you got safety out of that. But the cost for that was dimming your light and dimming what allowed you to feel lit up in your life. And then you started trying to light that light again with lesser forms like cookies or jerking off or whatever. And so now you're learning how to hold that. You're learning how to ask a deeper question. What about that is turning me on? Great. And then you get to bring it home to the woman who you've committed your life to. And I imagine that has some sort of ancillary benefits in the bedroom. I don't want to pry, but yeah, that's the new game that we're playing.
I'm so excited that we're hitting this topic at the end of our podcast as we're bringing this to a close. Because if I look back at all the different episodes that we have, I imagine we talk a lot about these different behaviors and different things that we talked about just now related to masturbation and TV watching and all these sort of things. And now we see the science behind it. Now we can say like, oh, interesting. Here's the currency. Here's how it's all working. And I love that because we could live life at a 4 by hitting these little dopamines, living. I love what you just said there. And we can live a lesser life. We could live life at a 4 out of 10 and get our dopamine hits and have low dopamine and do the masturbation and watch all the TV in the world. And we're still going to continue with life. We may even hit that reward every once in a while and feel a really great hit for a temporary period of time. But that's not what we care about on this podcast and the work that we do. We're working towards being and living that great man within, and that's living life at a 10 out of 10. So I love understanding the science behind what it takes to live life at a 10, to live that great man within, instead of living that lesser life.
One more invitation to join us for the Bold Move 2023 Masterclass. It's taking place on Thursday, December the 8th. You do not need to attend live. Everybody who registers will get a replay of the recording. And your bold move is the courageous and decisive act in pursuit of the life that you want to live. And by executing on the one thing that's most important to you, it will fire up every other area of your life. So it's time to stop simply dreaming about or thinking about or talking about the thing that you've so badly wanted to do for months or even years now, and instead to start making plans to actually execute on it and to surround yourself with the energy of people who are also making bold moves in their lives. Because I can tell you, it's an infectious experience to hear about all of the success stories that other people have had. And I'm going to be sharing a lot of them in the masterclass that's happening on Thursday, December the 8th. So link is at the top of the show notes. See you there.